Welcome back. Hey, every scar has a story, every betrayal leaves a mark, and every secret eventually comes to light. From heartbreaking family conflicts to shocking relationship betrayals, these emotional stories will take you through pain, resilience, and the moments when karma finally comes knocking. Don't forget to subscribe. Your next unforgettable tale starts now. "You're the biggest failure I've ever married," my wife, Vanessa, said as she tossed my overnight bag onto the couch front porch of our Charlotte, North Carolina home. She didn't lower her voice, even though our neighbors could hear every word. "You couldn't build a future if someone handed you the blueprint." She folded her arms while her father, Leonard, stood behind her with a satisfied grin. "Take your things and leave. This house belongs to people who actually know how to succeed." I looked from my wife to my father-in-law, hoping one of them would show even a trace of compassion. Neither of them did. My 12 years of marriage ended with the click of a deadbolt. I stood there holding 2 duffel bags while Vanessa stared through the front window without a hint of regret. She didn't cry. She didn't hesitate. She simply turned away as though throwing me out was another chore to check off her list. Her father lingered just long enough to smirk before following her inside. I remember thinking that the silence afterward hurt more than the insults. Everything I had worked for seemed to disappear behind that locked door. Here's how it happened. When I met Vanessa in Durham nearly 15 years earlier, she wasn't interested in money. At least that's what I believed. She laughed at my terrible jokes, encouraged my dreams, and told everyone I was the hardest working man she'd ever known. I was a junior financial analyst earning just enough to cover rent and student loans. She worked in marketing and constantly talked about building a life together. We married believing we would grow side by side, celebrating every milestone no matter how small. Things changed after Leonard's manufacturing company began making serious money. His business supplied specialty metal components to regional construction firms throughout the Carolinas. As contracts grew larger, so did his ego. Every family gathering turned into another opportunity for him to measure everyone by their income. He drove newer cars, bought a larger home, and started introducing himself as the man who never loses. Slowly, Vanessa began repeating his opinions. At first it was harmless teasing. Before long, it became the language of our marriage. "Leonard says real providers own companies," she would say whenever I came home after another 12-hour workday. If I mentioned being tired, she called me weak. If I celebrated a raise, she reminded me it wasn't ownership. If I talked about investing, she laughed and asked why I wasn't rich already. Every accomplishment became evidence that I still wasn't enough. I stopped sharing my goals because they only gave her new ways to mock me. The truth was that I had goals I couldn't discuss with anyone. Years earlier, my grandfather had taught me a lesson that shaped my life. "People will applaud what they can see," he once told me, "but wealth grows best where applause can't reach it." After he passed away, he left me a modest inheritance. Not enough to retire, but enough to begin investing carefully. I promised myself I would never chase appearances. Every dollar had a purpose. While Vanessa and Leonard obsessed over expensive watches and luxury vacations, I quietly studied balance sheets after work. I earned professional certifications, read annual reports late into the night, and invested consistently instead of recklessly. Some investments failed. Others barely moved. A few performed better than I imagined. None of it happened overnight. My progress was slow, disciplined, and invisible. From the outside, I looked like an ordinary employee. I preferred it that way. Leonard couldn't understand invisible success because he believed success only counted if everyone noticed it. At Sunday dinners, he compared me to other husbands in the family. "Malcolm bought his wife a lake house," he'd announce. "Anthony owns 3 franchises. What's your big accomplishment this year?" Vanessa usually answered before I could. "Is still collecting paychecks." Everyone laughed while I forced a smile that grew harder to fake with each passing month. I never argued because experience taught me arguments only entertained people who had already made up their minds. Instead, I kept working. I accepted consulting projects during evenings and weekends under confidentiality agreements that prevented me from discussing my clients. The additional income flowed into a small investment partnership I had formed with 2 former colleagues I trusted completely. We weren't chasing overnight riches. We specialized in acquiring overlooked businesses that still had strong fundamentals beneath temporary problems. Vanessa noticed the long hours but assumed they proved I was desperate. She never asked what I was actually building. Instead, she complained that I wasn't available for spontaneous shopping trips or expensive restaurants. Every sacrifice I made for our future became another reason she believed I lacked ambition. She confused quiet discipline with failure because the results hadn't become visible yet. The first real crack in Leonard's empire appeared during an anniversary dinner. He spent most of the evening bragging about landing an enormous supply contract that would guarantee another decade of growth. I congratulated him sincerely. Months later, I learned through publicly available industry reports that the contract depended almost entirely on one major customer. If that customer walked away, his company would be dangerously exposed. I kept that observation to myself. It wasn't my place to interfere. Around the same time, one of my partners brought a confidential opportunity to our investment group. A respected manufacturing company somewhere in the Southeast was quietly struggling beneath impressive headlines. Revenue looked strong, but debt obligations were mounting, equipment was aging, and management had delayed difficult decisions for years. We didn't know the company's identity yet because the broker had anonymized the information. We only knew the numbers told a story pride couldn't hide. My partners and I signed a strict non-disclosure agreement before we were allowed to review the complete financial package. The broker emphasized that the seller's identity would remain confidential until the next stage of negotiations. That wasn't unusual in acquisitions. Owners often wanted to prevent employees, customers, and competitors from panicking. I spent the weekend reviewing spreadsheets, cash flow reports, equipment depreciation schedules, and customer concentration data. The company had potential, but only if someone was willing to make difficult decisions instead of protecting old habits. On Monday morning, I sat in our conference room with my partners, Isaiah and Renee. We had built our investment fame one careful acquisition at a time, always staying out of the spotlight. We never chased companies with glamorous headlines. We looked for businesses that still had excellent employees and valuable customers but suffered from poor leadership or mounting debt. Isaiah tapped the file on the table. "This one could become our biggest investment yet," he said, "if the numbers are accurate." A week later, the broker revealed the seller's identity during a secure video meeting. The moment the company logo appeared on the screen, my stomach tightened. It was Leonard Industrial Components, my father-in-law's company. For several seconds I couldn't speak. Renee noticed the change in my expression. "You know these people?" she asked quietly. I nodded once before explaining that the owner was my wife's father. Neither of my partners smiled. They simply asked whether I could remain objective. I answered honestly, "Only if we treat this exactly like every other deal." That night, I drove home wrestling with emotions I hadn't expected. Part of me wanted to walk away from the opportunity entirely. Mixing business with family rarely ended well. Another part of me knew our responsibility was to our investors and employees, not my personal discomfort. If another buyer acquired the company, Leonard could still lose control. The market didn't care about family relationships. It cared about balance sheets and repayment schedules. At dinner, Vanessa barely looked up from her phone. "Dad's company is expanding again," she said proudly. "He'll probably buy another building before the year ends." I almost told her what I'd learned, but the information was confidential and incomplete. Instead, I asked how her father had been feeling. She laughed. Confident, unlike some people. The comment landed exactly the way she intended. I finished my meal in silence while she interpreted my quietness as defeat. 2 weeks later, our due diligence uncovered the real problem. Leonard hadn't simply borrowed money to grow the company. He had repeatedly refinanced debt to cover declining margins while telling everyone business had never been better. Several key machines were overdue for replacement. Major customers were negotiating lower prices, and one important contract was unlikely to be renewed. The company still had value, but time was running out. Pride had become more expensive than honesty. Family gatherings grew increasingly uncomfortable. Leonard continued boasting about future expansion while privately scrambling to satisfy lenders. Because of confidentiality rules, I couldn't challenge anything he said. Listening to him describe unstoppable success while knowing the financial reality felt surreal. Vanessa absorbed every word. On the drive home, she compared me to her father again. Some men build legacies, she said. Others just make excuses. I gripped the steering wheel and reminded myself that proving someone wrong was never a reason to make an investment. The next month brought another painful surprise. Vanessa had been quietly moving money from our joint savings into an account I couldn't access. When I asked about it, she shrugged. I'm protecting myself. You never know when someone who's falling behind will become a financial burden. Her words hurt more than the missing money. She wasn't acting like a partner preparing for hard times together. She was preparing for life without me while still expecting me to pay half the bills. I met with an attorney the following week, not to prepare for divorce, but to understand my legal options regarding our finances. The attorney advised me to document everything carefully and avoid emotional confrontations. Facts matter, she said, especially when emotions are running high. I followed that advice. Every bank statement, every transfer, every major expense went into an organized file. I hoped I would never need it, but I refused to be unprepared. Meanwhile, negotiations over Leonard Industrial Components became more serious. Our fame wasn't the only bidder. A larger private equity group wanted to buy the company, cut costs aggressively, and sell off valuable equipment. We had a different plan. We believed the business could survive if it focused on modernizing operations and retaining its experienced workforce. The numbers still had to make sense, but we weren't interested in stripping the company for quick profits. One evening, Leonard called unexpectedly. He had never phoned just to ask how I was doing, so I knew something was different. His tone was unusually polite. You've worked in finance for a long time, he said. Hypothetically, what would you tell someone considering outside investors? I answered in general terms, careful not to reveal anything confidential. He thanked me and ended the call. It was the first conversation we'd had in years without an insult. Even then, it felt less like respect than desperation. I didn't know it yet, but that phone call marked the beginning of a chain of events that would change every relationship in my life. Leonard believed he was choosing the future of his company. Vanessa believed she was choosing a future without me. Neither of them realized those two decisions were moving toward the same destination. The weeks that followed felt like I was living two completely different lives. During the day, I sat in conference rooms reviewing forecasts, equipment valuations, and lender requirements. Every decision demanded patience and precision. At home, however, patience had become a liability. Vanessa had stopped speaking to me unless she wanted to criticize something. If I came home late from work, she accused me of avoiding responsibility. If I came home early, she questioned why I wasn't working harder. There was no version of me that met her expectations anymore. One Friday evening, she hosted a dinner for her parents and a few family friends. I wasn't told until that afternoon. By the time I arrived, everyone was already seated around the dining table. Leonard dominated the conversation as usual, telling stories about multimillion-dollar contracts and successful entrepreneurs he claimed were his close friends. Then he looked directly at me. Malcolm, tell everyone what you've accomplished this year. Before I could answer, Vanessa laughed softly. His accomplished surviving another year of mediocrity. The room filled with uncomfortable chuckles. I noticed that one elderly aunt looked embarrassed on my behalf, but nobody challenged Vanessa or Leonard. I answered calmly. I've been fortunate to work on projects I'm proud of. Leonard waved dismissively. That's what people say when they have nothing impressive to report. I quietly finished my meal, realizing that defending myself would only provide another opportunity for ridicule. Sometimes dignity meant refusing to compete in a contest designed for someone else to win. After everyone left, I asked Vanessa why she enjoyed humiliating me in front of her family. She didn't deny it. She simply shrugged. Maybe if you were more successful, there wouldn't be anything to laugh about. Those words settled over the room like cold rain. They weren't spoken in anger. They were spoken with complete certainty. That hurt more than shouting ever could. At the office the following Monday, our legal team informed us that Leonard's lenders had imposed stricter conditions before approving any restructuring. Unless fresh capital arrived soon, default would become a real possibility. Isaiah looked around the conference table. If we're going to proceed, we need to be certain we're buying a business worth rebuilding, not rescuing someone's pride. We agreed to continue our review, knowing the next few weeks would determine everything. Around the same time, one of Leonard's largest customers quietly reduced future orders. The news wasn't public, but it significantly affected projected revenue. Our financial models changed overnight. The acquisition was still viable, though only at a lower valuation. Nobody celebrated that conclusion. Businesses weren't numbers on a spreadsheet alone. Hundreds of employees depended on the outcome. At home, Vanessa became increasingly distant. She spent more evenings with her parents, often returning late without explanation. One afternoon, I found brochures for luxury condominiums tucked inside her desk drawer. When I asked about them, she didn't bother hiding the truth. "I'm planning for the future," she replied. "You should probably do the same." A few days later, she invited me to lunch at a downtown restaurant. For one brief moment, I hoped she wanted to repair our marriage. Instead, she slid a neatly prepared envelope across the table. Divorce papers. She folded her hands and looked at me with the same expression someone might wear while canceling an unwanted subscription. "I've already made my decision," she said. "I'm tired of waiting for you to become the man I thought I married." Her voice remained calm throughout the conversation. There was no anger, only dismissal. "Dad warned me years ago that you didn't have the mindset of a winner. I should have listened." I closed the folder without signing anything. "Is there anything left worth saving?" I asked quietly. She didn't hesitate. No, it was the shortest answer she'd given me in months, and somehow it carried the greatest weight. I stood, paid the bill, and wished her well. She seemed almost disappointed that I hadn't argued. That evening, I met with my attorney again. We discussed the divorce, our finances, and the importance of remaining professional regardless of how painful things became. Before leaving, she looked me in the eye and said, "People often mistake calmness for weakness. Don't make the same mistake about yourself." I carried those words with me as the legal process began. 3 days later, our investment group received the call we had been waiting for. Leonard's advisors had decided to enter exclusive negotiations with us. They believed our proposal offered the best chance of preserving the company's future and protecting its workforce. Confidentiality remained absolute. Leonard still had no idea who ultimately stood behind the investment partnership. Neither did Vanessa. As negotiations intensified, I made one request to my partners. "If this deal closes," I said, "every decision we make has to be based on what's best for the company and its employees, not my personal history." Renee nodded first. "That's the only way we would ever agree to move forward." Isaiah smiled slightly. Then we were all on the same page. Meanwhile, Vanessa told friends and relatives that divorcing me was the smartest decision she'd ever made. Leonard repeated his familiar line that some people simply weren't built for success. Neither of them knew that the paperwork crossing their attorneys' desks each day was quietly connecting our futures in ways they had never imagined. The collision was no longer a possibility. It was only a matter of time. Closing day arrived with none of the drama television likes to invent. There were no reporters outside the building, no cameras, and no celebration. Just attorneys, accountants, lenders, and pages of documents that represented months of negotiations. My partners and I arrived early at a law office in Charlotte. We reviewed the final purchase agreement one last time. If everyone signed, our investment firm would become the new majority owner of Leonard Industrial Components before the close of business. Leonard entered the conference room with 2 attorneys and his chief financial officer. He looked exhausted. The confidence he had displayed at family dinners had been replaced by the weight of difficult decisions. He recognized me immediately, but only as Vanessa's husband. His expression shifted to confusion when one of our attorneys greeted me as a managing partner. He glanced toward my nameplate, then back at me, saying nothing. The introductions were brief and professional. No one mentioned family relationships. Our lead attorney explained the agenda, the financing terms, and the transition plan. Leonard listened carefully. He asked detailed questions about debt restructuring, employee retention, and supplier contracts. Every answer came from the documents already negotiated. The meeting focused on the future of the company, not the history between us. During a short break, Leonard approached me privately. "I didn't know you were involved," he admitted. His voice lacked its usual edge. I answered honestly. The investment group evaluated the business on its merits. I asked everyone to treat this like any other transaction. He studied my face for a moment before nodding. Neither of us revisited old arguments. The work in front of us mattered more. By late afternoon, every signature had been completed. Ownership officially changed hands. Leonard would remain for a limited transition period under the agreement, helping transfer operational knowledge before stepping away from day-to-day management. It wasn't the ending he had imagined for the company he spent decades building, but it gave the business its best chance to survive and protected many of the jobs that depended on it. The first executive meeting under the new ownership took place the following week. I sat beside Renee and Isaiah as department leaders discussed equipment upgrades, safety improvements, and plans to reduce unnecessary costs without large layoffs. We approved a modernization strategy that would be implemented over the next 18 months. The conversation stayed practical from beginning to end. News of the completed acquisition spread through the family quickly. Vanessa called me for the first time in weeks. Her voice was measured, almost uncertain. She asked whether the rumors were true, that I had been one of the owners behind the investment firm. I confirmed that I was. There was a long silence before she quietly said, "I didn't know." I replied, "There was never an opportunity to discuss confidential business." The conversation ended politely but without any expectation that it would change the course of the divorce. Over the following months, the company stabilized. New equipment reduced production delays. Long overdue maintenance improved reliability. Employees who had feared losing their jobs began to see consistent orders return. The progress wasn't dramatic, and it certainly wasn't instant, but it was real. It came from disciplined planning rather than grand promises. My own life gradually became quieter. The divorce concluded through the normal legal process. I moved into a modest home closer to the office, reconnected with old friends, and found peace in routines that had nothing to do with proving anyone wrong. For the first time in years, my evenings were free from arguments about whether I measured up to someone else's definition of success. Looking back, I realized the hardest part of the journey wasn't building a successful investment firm. It was learning not to let another person's opinion define my value. Success had never erased the painful memories of my marriage, but it gave me the freedom to stop carrying them every day. I no longer needed anyone's approval to believe in the life I had built. Every so often, I drive past one of the company's facilities. I see employees arriving for work, trucks pulling into the loading docks, and lights on inside the offices. Those ordinary moments remind me why our firm pursued the acquisition in the first place. Saving a business was never about winning an argument. It was about preserving something worth rebuilding. If there's one lesson my experience taught me, it's that character is revealed over time, not in a single conversation. Some people measure success by appearances, titles, or the ability to belittle others. I measure it differently now. Success is waking up with peace of mind, honoring your commitments, treating people fairly, and quietly building a life that doesn't depend on someone else admitting they were wrong. That has been the most meaningful victory of all. Before you go, tell me in the comments, what would you have done in this situation? And if you love emotional stories filled with shocking twists, betrayal, and satisfying karma, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss a new story from Emma Details. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next tale.